Good evening and welcome to the ICAS Spring Symposium Special 2021. I'm Shinja Kim, President and Chair of ICAS. Thank you all for joining us at this special event on the topics related to the Korean Peninsula issues and U.S. national security. It is my pleasure to introduce today's special guest speaker, the Honorable Michèle Flournoy. It's good to see you, Michèle. Welcome. Michèle Flournoy is a co-founder and managing partner of WestExec Advisors and a former co-founder and chief executive officer of the Center for a New American Study, where she currently serves on the board. The Honorable Flournoy served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy for 3 years from February 2009, and she was the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the formation of the national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and in National Security Council deliberations. Michèle led the development of the Department of Defense's 2012 strategic guidance and represented the department in dozens of foreign engagement in the media, and before the U.S. Congress. Prior to confirmation, the Honorable Flournoy co-led Obama's transition team at the Defense Department. In January 2007, Michèle co-founded CNAS, a bipartisan think tank dedicated to developing strong, pragmatic, and principled national security policies. She served as CNAS president until 2009 and returned as a CEO in 2014. And in 2017, Michèle co-founded WestExec Advisors, a strategic advisory firm. Previously, she was senior advisor at the CSIS for several years, and prior to that, a distinguished research professor at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. In the mid-1990s, the Honorable Flournoy served as the Principal Deputy and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategic and Threat Reduction and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Defense for Strategy. Michèle served on the boards of CNAS, Booz Allen Hamilton, Amida Technology Solutions, The Mission Continues, The Spirit of America, and CARE, C-A-R-E. Also, she serves on the advisory board PIMCO and Open Trans and on the honorary advisory committee of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. Michèle is also a former member of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, the CIA Director's External Advisory Board, and the Defense Policy Board, and she is currently a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Aspen Strategy Group. And she's a senior fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center and Science International Affairs. Michèle earned a bachelor's degree in social studies from Harvard University and a master's degree in international relations from the Balliol College, Oxford University, where she was a Newton Tatum Scholar. She is a recipient of numerous awards and honors, and she appears frequently in national and international media and frequently quoted in top-tier newspapers. Ladies and gentlemen, it is certainly my pleasure to have Michèle Flournoy at our platform today, and hope you enjoy this uncommon opportunity. So please join me welcoming Michèle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for that very warm welcome. Very nice introduction. Thank you so much.
Okay. Now the floor is yours, Michèle.
Well, I think, I wanted to start off by just giving an overview of U.S. foreign policy in the Biden administration as sort of broader context in which we can have a more focused conversation about Korea in particular and what's happening on the peninsula and so forth. So I'm just going to set the table very briefly with some, some context, and then we can dive into the 60 questions you said you've received. So, I think the Biden administration is coming in with a couple of core assumptions. The first is that in order to effectively re-engage in the world and recover our position of leadership and influence, we have to start by putting our house in order at home. And so, the president was very clear that COVID, getting the pandemic under control, turning the corner on that was going to be his first priority. And while that's clearly a domestic priority, it's a prerequisite to, I think, having a sort of effective policy of engaging the world. So turn the corner on COVID, and then the corollary to that is get the economy moving again. Really the Build Back Better idea, but really, get the economy moving, get growth happening, bring jobs back, and so forth. The infrastructure, the relief plan, the infrastructure investment, these are key elements. And the reason why those are important to foreign policy, or one of the reasons, is, if you spend any time in Beijing these days, the overarching narrative on television, talking to people, is a narrative of U.S. decline, that the U.S. mishandled the pandemic. We've taken a terrible economic hit. We've have these internal divisions that are polarizing and paralyzing our society. And so the U.S. is down and out. And this is a moment for China to step in, to play more of an assertive role in shaping international norms and rules and institutions and so forth. So I think the Biden administration's premise is we've got to not just say that diagnosis is wrong, but demonstrate that it's wrong by, again, getting our house in order, as a first, kind of first priority, as a foundation for our foreign policy and re-engagement. A second key belief is that another foundation, or I would say a unique source of strategic advantage for the United States, is our network of alliances and partnerships around the world. It is truly unique. China doesn't have such a network. Russia doesn't have such a network. Iran, they have proxies, but they don't have a network of alliances and partners. And you can go down the list, certainly not North Korea. So this is a true area of advantage. And when you think about the problems we face, whether it's climate change, whether it's dealing with North Korea's nuclear program, whether it's dealing with a rising China that is kind of rocking the boat on the international order, none of these can be solved by the U.S. alone, no matter how strong the U.S. is. We need to build coalitions of like-minded states who share our interests and often our values. And that's how we're going to be most successful. And so, again, you see the administration taking time up front to engage our key allies, starting with the Quad. And that was an historic meeting, trips to NATO and engaging with our partners in Europe, and now bilaterally engaging with key allies in Asia and more broadly. So I think, again, that's all sort of setting the table, if you will, for then taking on some of the hard issues, whether it's sitting down with China about trade and managing the competition economically and technologically and otherwise, or whether it's engaging more seriously on the North Korean issue and others. So that's how I see them proceeding. And what that means is that they are not in a rush to get into some of these issues until they feel that they're in a stronger position domestically and that they've had time to really do policy reviews on all of these issues. So I think that that combined with the slow pace of nomination and confirmations, actually getting the new team in the door and in place, means that I don't think you're going to see a lot of new initiatives until the fall timeframe. And so I know that a lot of people are impatient, feeling like where's the policy, where's the policy? But when you look at how many positions are still not filled, and you look at this, if you understand this approach of building strength domestically so that we have a firmer foundation to engage internationally, I'm just trying to explain how I'm making sense of the sort of pace of things and the timing of things as I see it. I do think that the main focus is going to be initially on managing the China competition, and while bolstering deterrence to try to prevent it from crossing the line to conflict, and also pursuing areas of cooperation where it's absolutely essential, be it on climate or areas like North Korea. And so it's a multi-dimensional chess game that they're going to have to play with China. But I think that is going to be a priority issue. I think you're going to see the administration continue to take steps to reduce the demand coming out of the Middle East in terms of diverting resources and leader bandwidth to engage there. I think that's a lot of what was driving the Afghanistan withdrawal decision. The problem is the region doesn't always cooperate, as we're seeing today with the Israel-Palestinian, flare-up, and as we've seen with Iran's provocative behavior on various occasions and so forth. But they are trying to make a strategic shift to spend relatively more of their time and bandwidth on the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific. And that's, I think, going to continue to drive a lot of their strategy and their thinking. The last thing I'll say is I think this is an administration that's going to try to take a more integrated approach to domestic and foreign policy. And so, looking at, for example, in the competition with China, again, their premise is the best thing we can do is invest in the drivers of our competitiveness at home. The second best thing we can do is invest in the drivers of the competitiveness of our allies and partners. And then approach the specific foreign policy engagement from there. And so you're going to see some unusual players at the table. You're going to have a lot more domestic agencies in the foreign policy discussions. You're going to have a lot of working out of issues between the kind of economic cluster and the foreign policy cluster. And you're going to see a lot of much greater emphasis in the White House on driving technology innovation. Those of us who've worked in different administrations, you rarely see an Office of Science and Technology Policy that's a big player. It's going to be a major player in this White House, in this administration. And I think that technology agenda is going to permeate into a lot of our alliance and partner relationships to explore areas of cooperation there. So let me just stop there because, again, if you have 60 questions, I'd much rather get to at least some number of those rather than go on. But just that's kind of a broader context into which some of the specific issues that we're going to discuss today can be seen.
Thank you, Michèle. The first question is, how effective can diplomacy work out in today's environment in the Korean Peninsula?
So I think we have to take a sort of whole of government approach, which means yes, diplomacy, and I do think another tenet of the Biden administration is to try to put diplomacy back in the front of our policy and our engagement in the world, and then have the other instruments sort of back that up. But I think you're going to see the pairing of traditional diplomacy with coercive instruments like sanctions, like deterrence measures, defensive measures, security assistance to allies, and other things to try to make that diplomacy more effective. So I do think at some point there will be a diplomatic outreach to engagement of North Korea. But again, I don't think they're in a rush. And I think they're really trying to take stock. We've tried so many different things, right? And none of it has ultimately kind of delivered on the ultimate objective. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned here and a lot of thinking, fresh thinking to be done to say, is there a different way to approach this that might get a different outcome? And I'm not sure what the answer is but just, I mean, you all don't need to be reminded of this because you've been even closer to this issue than I have. But I remember my very first intelligence briefing in the Pentagon in 1993 warned of the imminent collapse of North Korea. And it's obviously a long time since then, and this problem continues to be with us. So,
all right, thank you, Michèle. Next question is, how can U.S., its allies and partners cooperate in the great power competition?
Yeah, well, I do think that, I think we have to assess China in a very clear-eyed way and try to really understand what its objectives are and what it's trying to do. And it really, in my view, it's really trying to reassert its influence and dominance in the region that it's traditionally defined as kind of its sphere of influence, but then also to play an outsized or leading role internationally in fora where rules of the road are decided, whether that's internet standards, whether that's the UN or other multilateral fora. And, when you look at what their approach, it's based on an authoritarian, the interests and values of an authoritarian system. And it often attracts the support of other authoritarian states, whether that's Russia or others. I think there are, in many cases, a very common set of interests among those countries that share an interest in democracy and human rights and rule of law, and the sort of both the interests and the values that we share with many of our allies, I would say all of our allies, almost all of our allies. And so it's in our interest to find ways to come together in coalitions in those fora and push back together to influence outcomes. And so we really have to, the U.S. can't compete with China alone. It would be foolish to try. This is more of a question of how do we, as like-minded states, integrate, welcome China where it's playing by the rules and adding value and rightfully deserves to be treated as a great power, but, pushing back where it is violating international norms and laws that we hold dear. It's a shared interest. It should be a shared enterprise.
Thank you. Next question. In what area is the US-ROK alliance in need of great change and improvement?
The answer to that question often, unfortunately, has been whipsawed or changed a bit by both our elections and your election. Or our elections and South Korea's elections, I should say. I actually think the military cooperation has proved remarkably steady and robust. Always areas for improvement there, but I think it's very strong. I favor, an approach that tries to help South Korea become more active as a regional power. And so not just concern ourselves with what's happening on the peninsula, but how as partners, as allies, can we influence the broader region and what's going on? I think the administration has been right to try to help do what we can as the United States to help Korea and Japan overcome very deep historical differences and points of friction so that we can cooperate more effectively as allies. Because in any actual contingency scenario, that trilateral cooperation is going to be critical, and we want to make sure that it's going to work as well as possible. But I would defer to others. I don't know if I can put Vince Brooks or Bruce or any of you on the spot to answer whether there are parts of the relationship that you would like to see improved.
Good. Bruce Bennett, can you quickly chip in briefly?
Well, I think there have been some immense improvements with the beginning of the Biden administration. The SMA has been resolved. We're now talking friendly with regard to our allies. Those are really big and important changes. And I think we're looking forward to more, but we should see more coming out of the current KID that's going on and out of the summit meeting next week.
Yeah. I mean, the only other thing I would highlight is a really important area of cooperation. There's a lot of it already, but as we identify the critical technology areas where it's important for us to all, keep our edge, there's a lot of cooperation that can be happening between the U.S. and Korea, both at a government level, but also private sector level. There's just so much cooperation that is important there. Think semiconductors. I mean, it's just that's just one example, but so many areas where there are real opportunities there for us to kind of double down on the relationship.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Bruce. It seems the Biden administration sharing the similar threat perception with that of Trump administration. If so, how would Biden administration can enhance Indo-Pacific strategy per se?
Yeah. I think there are aspects of the threat perception that are shared, but I think the strategy to deal with them are going to be somewhat different. I think the first thing that I think the Biden administration is going to put a big emphasis on showing up, showing up diplomatically, not leaving critical diplomatic posts unfilled, showing up at the critical meetings that happen across the region, not just having everything in bilateral terms, but showing up in the multilateral fora where a lot of the region's business gets done, and not just military, but economic fora, and even, as I mentioned, technological fora, like related to standard setting and so forth. So showing up and leading with diplomacy is number one. But I think just a much more consultative approach. I mean, and it's genuine. It's not just, we're going to check the box by calling our allies. It's that we think, I think they think that the United States will be in a stronger position if we can actually align ourselves and go arm in arm together into some of these negotiations. So I think you're just going to have, and as Bruce said, that tone and tenor, you can already feel it. And I do think that, we've talked about the pivot or the rebalance for a long time. I think you're going to see more of it being implemented going forward, because not just from a military perspective, but just in terms of a leadership, bandwidth, focus, initiatives, and again, the early signaling from the administration has been, that's their intention.
Thank you. Next question is Quad issue. Would you anticipate the current Quad model may develop into NATO-type alliance? And if so, do you think the South Korea's position would be essential in developing the Quad or Quad Plus strategy?
I don't see the Quad becoming a formal, NATO-like military alliance, because I think, a country like India, for example, probably would balk at that. Many others in the region who, have China as their primary economic trade partner, but the U.S. as their primary security partner, would feel caught in that situation. So I think we will see a deepening of the Quad's work together, like really making it less of a symbolic forum and more, I think, of an operational forum in terms of having an agenda. They're going to work on COVID and vaccines together. They're going to have concrete projects that they're working on together that are certainly in the security domain, but much more broadly as well. And I could also envision an expansion of the Quad to include other countries like South Korea coming in. But I think it will stop short of something like a military treaty-based military alliance, because I just don't think that sort of fits the political zeitgeist of the region in terms of what the countries would want and what they'd be comfortable with.
Thank you. Heather? Okay, I give you a privilege. Would you raise your question?
Sure.
Yes.
With a renewed focus on strategic competition, do you feel that the international community could potentially lose sight of North Korea and Iran's military advancements?
So I don't think they're going to lose sight of them. I do think the priority is going to be focused on China first and foremost. Russia, to the extent it's misbehaving. But unfortunately, what we tend to see is from both Iran and North Korea, if they feel too neglected, they do something provocative to demand attention. We've already seen that with Iran. I think we're likely to see it at some point with North Korea. So they won't be forgotten and they won't be neglected. I think right now the real challenge is this personnel problem, that you just have so few people confirmed and in office. I think as the team fills out, you will start to see dedicated teams working on both of these issues. Obviously, we're seeing it with Iran already because of trying to get back to some form of the JCPOA as a starting point. But I think you will also, see it more of that kind of normal interagency activity around North Korea once the right people are in place.
Thank you, Michelle. Next question. We've had a rather uneasy stalemate on the Korean Peninsula for the last 70 years. In this past situation, do you foresee a way forward, and what would be your epiphany, so to speak?
I do not have a solution to the problem. If somebody on this call does, please raise your hand and I'll give the floor to you to explain. But I do think that, I'm hoping that the sort of review that the administration's doing, just starting, is to kind of really understand where we've been, what's worked, what hasn't, and why, will yield maybe some fresh thinking about the approach. I think the fundamental policy question is, do we continue to insist on denuclearization and as the ultimate requirement for anything else to happen? Or, as some argue, do we, sort of not necessarily recognize North Korea as a nuclear power, a legitimate nuclear power, but sort of recognize the facts of their program and try to take more of an arms control approach, which is limiting their production capability, their deployments, their activities, and trying to manage down the threat that way. So it's a threat elimination versus threat management approach, if you will. And I think that's one of the, haven't heard any indication from the administration that they're moving to the threat management approach. I've heard only sort of sticking with denuclearization. But I do hear outsiders making that case and trying to, create more of a debate about this issue. Again, there are people on this call. I would love to hear your thoughts on what makes the most sense.
Oh, thank you. Dave Maxwell, would you like to quickly chip in?
You're on mute, Dave.
Please unmute, David. David Maxwell, unmute your button.
Sorry about that.
Good. Sure.
You caught me off guard.
Okay.
Mr. Flournoy, you mentioned in your opening remarks about your briefing in 1993 about imminent collapse of North Korea. And I don't think many of us who've dealt with this never predicted when it would collapse, but only if it does, it's going to be catastrophic.
Yes.
And I know you have a strong background in Korean contingency planning, dating back to your time in the Pentagon in the 1990s. But the current conditions in North Korea could possibly be far worse than what we observed during the arduous march in 94 to 96. And we may not see a relief valve such as the Sunshine Policy to bail out the regime. And furthermore, the resiliency of the Korean people, rooted in the growth of the some 400 markets, is now being impacted by the draconian population and resources control measures that the Kim family regime has been implementing, using the excuse of COVID, of course, to mitigate and defend against COVID. And they're using that to maintain control over the regime. And now we're seeing indications of potential low-level resistance among the population. As we maintain a foundation of deterrence and defense against conventional and nuclear attack, should we be committing more planning and resources again to other contingency plans for North Korean instability, internal instability, and potential regime collapse? And thank you for your excellent remark.
Yeah, for all of the reasons you cite, I do think it's important to dust off the collapse scenarios and make sure that we've updated them, that we've got, we have all kinds of new people in place. A lot of the people who are familiar with this and could recite it, backwards and forwards, like you, like Vince Brooks, like others. I think there are new players in place now, and I think making sure that we're thinking about not only how do we deter North Korea and deal with their provocations, but also what if. It's not necessarily a likely scenario, but it's not an impossible scenario, and the stakes would be huge. Given the nuclear arsenal that's even larger now. I will tell you, one of the things, we thought about it and we were worried about it even in the Obama administration. And I think it was written about in Secretary Gates's book, so I can share it with you. We tried to engage the Chinese on this question of what if, and is there a way we could manage our own, the assumption was China would intervene to prevent refugees pouring across its border. We would intervene to assist our ally, South Korea, in stabilizing their border, but also in dealing with, trying to make sure the nuclear weapons didn't get out of hand and the nuclear materials. But there's, when you look at the map of facilities and the geography, there's very likely that you could have U.S. and Chinese forces in the same areas. And that was not, something that should just happen without us thinking it through. So we really tried to engage them at a senior level on this and had zero uptake. It was like, oh, isn't it a nice day outside? They just come let's talk about the weather instead of even acknowledging the question. I think at the working level, there may have been some engagement, but I do think this has to be done certainly first in the U.S. with our, in tandem and hand in glove with our South Korean partners. But then at some point, we have to also try to have some quiet conversations with others in the region who would respond to such a contingency to avoid any kind of, accidental engagement that, or miscalculation.
Thank you. Now, the South Korea-Japan relations. How would you propose to strengthen South Korea-Japan relations so that Biden's policy should be further supported?
Yeah, I think the administration has done a good job trying to sort of get the broader relationship on a better, more even keel. I think I'm a big fan of common projects. When you get things out of the theoretical and into what can we get done together that benefits us both, you tend to get, better results. So I would love to see us develop a really robust agenda of common projects related to enhancing deterrence and defense for both with regard to North Korea, but also with regard to China. That we could do either, we could do trilaterally in the region.
Well, thank you. Now it's the pandemic issues. How would you mitigate the pandemic impact on the Korean Peninsula vis-a-vis North Korea, South Korea, China, and Japan?
Wow. I think I need a public health official to. I think again. I actually think initially Korea did quite a good job in managing this, I think at some point it would be worthwhile, all of us with allies again, taking a deep breath, stepping back and thinking through together, what are some of the lessons to be learned? What did we do that worked individually and collectively? What did we do that did not work and that in retrospect looked like a mistake? How do we make sure that we as allies are better prepared in the future? What do we need to do individually? What do we need to do through multilateral organizations like the WHO or others? I mean, I really think that, we're still in the midst of it, but at some point we're going to be able to take a breath and think a little bit about a kind of an after action review, if you will, or some lessons learned to prepare us better for the future.
Thank you. Now, the cyber attack issues. And it is generally well understood that North Korea has a strong contingent of cyber hackers.
Yep. How
would you handle that?
Well, I think we are handling it day to day. I'd start, obviously each nation, U.S., South Korea, Japan, we all need our own sort of national cyber capabilities and policies to shore up our defenses. But I also think we could do a lot to share threat intelligence. What are we seeing coming out of North Korea? How do we give each other warning about what we're seeing? I think we can share best practices of whether it's defensive, whether it's finding insider threats, whether it's doing some more assertive pushing back on hackers or on the state-sponsored ones anyway. These are all areas where I think we could have a very rich cyber dialogue among allies that might position us a bit better in the future.
Well, that's very reassuring. Next question. What risk should the United States and South Korea be willing to take, either independently or also together, to make the progress with North Korea?
It's a great question, and I think we can take some diplomatic risk in terms of trying new approaches and sequencing and combinations. The nature of the military threat has grown substantially, continues to grow with the development of longer range delivery vehicles and the increasing stockpile of both weapons and missiles. And so, taking some diplomatic or political risk to try to get some serious negotiations going, some productive negotiations going, I think is worthwhile. where I am not willing to take risk is on the defense and deterrence side. I think we need to be doing more there to reduce the risk that we face should negotiations not be successful.
Any comments, anyone? To make a quick follow-up question? Without that, next question. How would you encourage the United States Congress, in this case, House of Representatives, to develop the strong strategy against North Korea's nuclear and missile strategy, so to speak?
So I would not look to Congress to develop a strategy. That's thing one. But I would look to them to try to get their buy-in to whatever strategy, the administration puts together, and particularly in making sure we fund the diplomatic initiatives that need to be undertaken, that we fund the development of more robust defenses, deterrence measures, cyber measures. I mean, these are all the things we've been talking about. They require investment, and so I think that's where I would focus my attention with Congress, and not just kind of selling them on individual programs, but really trying to get them to buy in to an overall strategy or approach, which I think the administration has to provide. I don't think we should expect that to come from Congress.
Okay.
You'll get 135 different strategies.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Julia Dongyeon Cho from Seoul. Julia, are you there? Okay,
Yeah,
Julia. Okay, raise your question.
So as you mentioned, technology is getting very important and significant technologically, militarily, and economically. And I'd like to ask your thoughts on explore some kind of national security innovation base between two countries.
Sure. Well, I would love.
Thank you.
It's a great question, and I think it is probably the most underdeveloped area of cooperation that we could have, that we have today, that needs to develop much more. I think that to begin with, I think each nation needs to kind of assess, where do they want to be competitive going forward? Where are the areas where they feel they need to keep an advantage, either for economic or security reasons? And, it can't be everything. It has to be a discrete, set of areas. And then I think it would be worthwhile to sit down in a bilateral dialogue to say, where are we aligned, and where we are aligned, and we see, the threat from China as overriding our individual, the individual commercial interests of our companies, because we also compete against each other in many areas. But where can we form joint ventures? Where can we form, joint development projects? Where can we share research? Where can we share, we now have one of our investment arms or innovation arms in the U.S. government, InQtel, which serves the intelligence community, has just started working internationally, making investments in startups in allied countries where they have a particularly cutting edge, lead in a technology area. So I think this is a very ripe area for exploration, and it should be encouraged. But I would hope that both governments would encourage us exploring that. And again, I look at the semiconductor industry as an example. We have a lot of eggs in the basket of the TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And, that is very vulnerable. That situation is vulnerable to Chinese coercion, first and foremost, and less likely, but possible, military action. And, that is a vulnerability that we as a I think, a community have to address by diversifying our sources of supply. And I think Korea has a huge role to play in that, given Samsung. US has a huge role to play, given Intel. This is an area where we should look to be not only just competing on a company basis, but maybe collaborating a little bit as nation states with a shared vulnerability and some shared goals in addressing that.
Thank you, Michelle. Now, do you foresee that Japan may be influencing the US policy formulation towards North Korea and China?
Well, I think the fact that this is an administration seriously consulting with our allies, yes, Japan, but also South Korea, also Australia, also others, India, and others, Singapore. I mean, going throughout the region, those ideas coming not just Japan, but from the discussions with various allies and partners are, I think, being taken seriously and likely will help shape where U.S. policy comes out on North Korea. And you add to that the fact that, again, the U.S. can't be successful here alone. We need South Korea's to be an arm in South Korea when we approach this question. We need China to be trying to use leverage. I think it's diminished leverage, but some leverage still to push North Korea to the table seriously. There are many stakeholders that need to get aligned around an approach, and so taking the concerns of those countries into account, I think, is part of the process.
Thank you. Now, next question is on the North Korean people. I mean, real people. How would you propose to help North Koreans from famine and human rights abuse?
Yeah. Well, I think that there is a role we can play with humanitarian assistance. I've done that periodically over time. And also in terms of making exceptions to some of our sanctions coverage. I personally, absent regime change, I think we're limited in what we can do on the human rights front, except to use our traditional diplomacy and our engagement in multilateral fora to get the international community to condemn some of the worst abuses and to put some pressure on the regime. So I think we have to address it. It has to be part of the conversation. I think we probably have greater potential to impact on the humanitarian side than we do on the behavior of the regime internally.
Thank you. What's your assessment of China's level of influence on Kim's North Korea?
I would love to get some expert views on this, but I am not an expert on this, but my impression is that it has diminished somewhat, both because of the actions of the North Korean leader, but also because of the key elements of the relationship in terms of dependency and so forth. I think back in the Obama administration, we really pushed China based on the assumption they could deliver North Korea if they pushed hard enough. And I'm just not sure that even if they wanted to deliver North Korea, I'm not sure that they could. So I would love to hear from all of you if there's somebody who believes that China has a lot of leverage that they're not, that they aren't using. I'd love to know what that is, because that would be very useful to know for our own diplomacy with China.
Very good. Thank you. Is Joe Bosco, are you there? Joe Bosco, could you quickly chip in? Well, if not, next question. Would you commit to the no-use policy of the nuclear arsenal against any foreseeable enemies, so to speak?
You know, I would not, because of our extended deterrence commitments to our allies like Japan and South Korea. I think you can be very clear that the use of nuclear weapons would be a last resort, that they should be at the back of our employment strategy, not the front, that we should do everything in our power to try to prevent escalation to any kind of nuclear use by any country. But I think if you say no first use, you have just undercut the nuclear guarantee that we give to our critical allies. And I think that would be, a negative change in policy that we should not pursue.
Thank you. Next question. Good old six-party format. Do you?
I'd love to kick Russia out, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Good old six-party format.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Would you force? Yeah, go ahead.
I think you're asking, would you keep it or would you change it?
Keep it or change it or modify one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you sort of go around the table, I think the one, I think if where we can get alignment among those parties, it is obviously more powerful than if it's just the U.S. alone or just the U.S. and South Korea alone, or U.S., South Korea, Japan. But on the other hand, if you were to kick, my nominee for consideration of expulsion would be Russia under Putin, because I don't think he's there to be terribly helpful. But I think if you actually kicked Russia out, you just make Putin more of a spoiler. So, I think that it's a format that maybe we could look at, concentric circles of, different groups in different combinations. But again, I honestly haven't thought deeply about this question. I am sure there are folks in the State Department that are wrestling with alternative formats. I would love to see something that's more productive, but I'm not sure what that is.
Thank you. Bruce Bechtel, Texas. Bruce, are you there? Bruce Bechtel?
I am here. How are you?
Okay. All right. Quickly, go ahead.
Well, as we all know, including you, Michelle, illicit activities account for roughly 40% of North Korea's real economic power, and proliferation counts for the biggest chunk of that. So my question would be, what would you recommend for a new or amended North Korea counterproliferation policy? Should we reinvigorate and aggressively execute PSI or some new program? And how can we effectively prevent North Korean proliferation to conflict zones such as the Middle East, which, as we know from the latest UN panel of expert report, is ongoing and robust?
Thank you, Bruce.
It's a great point. I do think this is an area that needs renewed attention, because of the economic impact it has for North Korea and because of the negative impact it has on, conflict situations elsewhere. I do think that, again, this has to be an effort where we sort of rebuild a coalition of states that are really paying attention to this and willing to not only monitor and alert, but in some cases interdict some of these shipments and so forth. I also think China is a critical player here, because so much of it goes through either China itself or through Chinese shipping or what have you. The good news is we have some amazing new tools, AI-enabled new tools. My WestExec hat, we work with several AI companies, but one that is taking all unclassified data and basically able to track down to the individual ship level all kinds of illicit activities and cargoes and sanctions busting activity. And even if you reflag the ship, you change its name, you try to make it look like it's a different ship, they have some particular things that they measure and watch to know, no, that's the ship. It's the same ship. So we have some data and some tools that we never had when PSI was in vogue, for example, then they're unclassified, they're shareable. I think there's from an information and situational awareness perspective, we could have a much clearer picture from which to decide what actions to take.
Very good. Thank you. Now, another Bruce from California. Bruce, this is your story of San Francisco and Seoul. Go ahead.
Certainly. Thank you. So we know North Korea is working on developing a significant nuclear weapon ICBM force. Once they have that, what happens with the U.S. nuclear umbrella? Will it be, as the French would have put it, the U.S. prepared to risk San Francisco to preserve Seoul from nuclear attack?
I think that we're going to have to bolster our deterrence posture vis-a-vis North Korea to help them understand both our resolve and what they would experience if they were to launch a nuclear weapon towards the United States. I think we also need to double down on our missile defenses, but also unconventional means of, cyber and otherwise, of complicating their, the effective operation of their arsenal, shall we say. So I think we need to take this seriously. This threat has arrived, and we have to treat it as a real threat. Even though I think it's the likelihood of. I think it's a low likelihood event, but obviously a high consequence event. So we need to take a look at what more we can do as the United States, but also with our allies to strengthen, deterrence, to strengthen. Defense and some unconventional measures for making perhaps complicating the performance of the arsenal, shall we say? But I don't think it's not cause to reevaluate our commitment, our extended deterrence commitment. In my view, I think it's a test of that, but I would not back off of that commitment. Because then you open a whole nother can of worms. Do our allies now feel that they need to nuclearize themselves, and then you set off, potentially a round of proliferation that would not be in anybody's interest.
Very good. Now, next question is CVID versus arms control issues. What would be your position when time is right, whether we should pursue the CVID goal or peppered with arms control approach?
I'm willing to. I think that denuclearization should remain the ultimate goal. I'm willing to, entertain phased approaches to getting there that would, trade a reduction in the threat either through constraining production or constraining deployment or constraining the size of arsenals, on the way towards that goal, with some, step-by-step reducing of our pressure, the pressure we've put on them. I'm willing to entertain that, but I don't think that we should accept this regime as a nuclear armed power. I think that would be a very dangerous thing to accept.
Thank you. Now, next question is maximum pressure issues versus Kim regime's legitimacy issues. What is your position in dealing with KJU's administration vis-a-vis South Korea's Moon administration?
I think that I think that we need pressure to support our diplomacy to be effective with North Korea. But I also believe that the maximum pressure campaign as practiced by the Trump administration was not effective, partly because it divided us from our close ally. And I think we're going to be most effective when the United States, South Korea, Japan, and hopefully, if you can get them on board, China, we all sit down in a united approach to Korea. Now, China may be too hard to get as a general matter, but I think we should be striving to have a unified approach across the US, South Korea, and Japan. And that means that we should consider, again, be open to trying different approaches to sequencing diplomatic measures with coercive measures to see if we can get a different outcome or a different result. And that design needs to be based on a very fundamental and sustained dialogue with Seoul.
Thank you. Richard, this is the last question. Richard White, quickly.
Hey, Richard.
Richard? Are you sleeping, Richard? Richard White, unmute your button.
Sorry, can you hear me? I didn't know. I wrote my question in advance, but
okay.
It's more, I want to just thank the progress you made strengthening missile defenses when you were in office. And I wasn't sure where you thought might be the next steps you want to go with the Japan-Korea network we're building there.
I do think I would love to see a trilateral discussion or bilateral discussions and a trilateral discussion on the question of collectively, what more can we do to shore up deterrence together, and both vis-a-vis both North Korea and China, and what can we all do in terms of crisis stability and strategic stability, really thinking through as allies as much as we can, because having been part of too many of Bruce's war games, the number of decisions, the fire hose of decisions that is going to come at not only the US, but our allies at the same time, early in a crisis situation, is absolutely overwhelming if you haven't thought it through in advance. And we use, as Vince can attest, we use our contingency planning, our war planning, to try to force ourselves to think through a lot of those things and be more prepared. And I know we do some of that with Korea, particularly on, contingencies related to the peninsula. But you can't do it enough, because it's just it would be an overwhelming, a really challenging set of things to manage, whether you're talking about, a North Korea, conflict scenario, a North Korea collapse scenario, or a Chinese aggression scenario. The more we can have strategic dialogues on these issues in advance to sort of try to get ourselves aligned in our strategies and thinking, the better. So that's where I would love to see the defense, part of the defense, discussion go.
Thank you, Michelle. This is the real last question. Tong, unmute your button.
Yeah, the question is whether you personally believe Biden administration will fare better at the time it finishes the first term with regard to what the administration can do with the denuclearization of North Korea or the Korean Peninsula. And if you feel one way or the other, please provide background for it.
I think they are going to work hard at this. And I think that a lot of the question about whether they fare better, I think they'll fare better if they, with a more allied approach, aligned approach among our allies. But it really depends on what the situation is from the perspective of the North Korean leadership and whether they feel they have to make any compromises or not. I don't know, and I'm not sure we can predict at this point over the next 4 years. But I do think that they will reinvigorate a diplomatic process, that they will do so taking into account lessons learned of 30 years of lessons learned, and that they will try to do it hand in glove, arm in arm with our closest allies to see if we can get a better result. But I must say, I mean, those of you who know me, I get up in the morning, I'm an optimist by nature. I'm a very generally positive person. This is a issue on which I am not terribly hopeful. I want to be hopeful, but my experience and history tells me to be be realistic and to not expect great progress or a breakthrough where it's been impossible to achieve in the past. But that said, got to try, and I think they will try.
Thank you very much, Michèle. This concludes this proceeding. Let's give Michèle a big round.
Well, it's great to see you all.
Thank you. We'll stay in touch.
Okay, take care.
All the best.
Okay.
Thank you. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.